I built a massive logistics empire from a freezing Chicago garage. I survived corporate raiders, market crashes, and backstabbing partners. But the most lethal strike of my life did not come from a boardroom. It came while I was fighting for my last breath on a hospital stretcher. I heard the emergency room doctor call my wife of 15 years to tell her I was having a massive heart attack. Her response chilled me faster than the icy fluids entering my veins. She told the doctor to give me a pill because her expensive first-class flights to Hawaii were leaving in hours. If you want to know what happens when a man realizes his wife is leaving him to die for a vacation, listen. I am Richard. I am 70 years old. On a crisp Tuesday morning, I was sitting behind the massive mahogany desk in my corner office overlooking the Chicago skyline. I was reviewing the quarterly projections for the supply chain software company I founded 4 decades ago. Back then, I was just a hungry kid coding in a garage that smelled of motor oil. Now, I controlled a logistics network moving billions in freight. But biology does not care about your net worth. It started as a dull ache. I ignored it, chalking it up to the black coffee I had consumed since dawn. Then came the taste of copper in my mouth. Before I could reach for my water, an invisible vice clamped down on my chest. It was an absolute crushing pressure, as if a freight truck had parked directly on my sternum. I tried to stand, but my legs gave out. I collapsed heavily onto the polished wood of my desk, scattering financial reports. I could not draw a breath. The air suddenly felt thick, heavy, unbreathable. My vision narrowed into a dark tunnel. Through the ringing in my ears, I heard my office door swing open. My secretary screamed. Time splintered into fragmented moments. The chaotic blur of faces, paramedics shouting my vitals, the sharp sting of a needle entering my arm, the violent jolt of the stretcher hitting the ambulance floor. Through it all, I remained conscious enough to understand the gravity of the situation. I calculated risks for a living, and the statistics of surviving what felt like my heart ripping itself apart were not in my favor. The sirens wailed a frantic soundtrack to the panic coursing through my fading mind. I had spent my entire life building an empire, securing my legacy, providing a life of luxury for my family, my wife Cynthia, my stepson Brandon. I had given them the world. As the ambulance tore through the streets, a sense of comfort washed over me. I thought, at least I will be surrounded by my family. I could not have been more wrong. The emergency room at City General was a symphony of controlled chaos. Bright fluorescent lights stabbed at my eyes. Nurses moved around me with urgent precision, attaching electrodes to my chest, calling out numbers that clearly alarmed them. I lay there staring at the ceiling tiles, my breathing shallow and ragged. The crushing weight on my chest had subsided slightly thanks to the drugs, but I knew I was dancing on the edge of the abyss. The attending physician, a young man with tired eyes, leaned over me. He told me I was experiencing a severe myocardial infarction. He needed to stabilize me before moving me to the cardiac intensive care unit. He asked for my emergency contact. I whispered Cynthia's name and gave him her number. I pictured her in our suburban mansion dropping whatever she was doing, rushing out the door in tears. I had treated her son Brandon as my own, placing him as the chief operating officer of my company. They were my world. The doctor dialed the number on his mobile phone and put it on speaker so I could hear her voice, hoping it would bring me comfort. It rang 3 times before she answered. There was background noise, the sound of zippers closing, luggage wheels rolling across hardwood floors. "Hello," Cynthia answered. Her tone was brisk, hurried. "Mrs. Cynthia," the doctor said, his voice calm and steady. "I am calling from City General Hospital. I am here with your husband, Richard. He has suffered a severe heart attack. We are working to stabilize him now, but his condition is critical. We need you to come to the hospital immediately." I waited for the gasp. I waited for the panic questions. I waited for the sound of my wife dropping everything. Instead, there was a long, heavy pause, then a sigh of pure, unadulterated annoyance. "Is this some kind of joke?" Cynthia said. Her voice was cold, sharp, and completely devoid of empathy. "Madam, please, I assure you this is not a joke," the doctor replied, clearly taken aback. Your husband is in critical condition. He needs his family. I heard the sound of a suitcase zipping shut on the other end of the line. I cannot come to the hospital right now, she snapped. Brandon and Tiffany have been packing for weeks. We are leaving for the airport in 2 hours. Our first-class flights to Maui are entirely non-refundable. The doctor glanced down at me, his eyes wide with disbelief. I lay paralyzed, copper returning to my mouth. Mrs. Cynthia, your husband might not survive of the night, the doctor said. You need to be here. Just give him a pill, Dr. Cynthia replied indifferently. He is a tough old man. He can manage. I am not ruining my vacation over this. We have a private yacht booked for tomorrow. Tell Richard to call me when he is discharged. Have a good day. The line went dead. The silence in the trauma bay was deafening. The doctor slowly lowered his phone, staring at it as if it had turned into a venomous snake. He looked at me, struggling to find words of comfort, but no words could fix what had just happened. My heart monitor began to beep wildly, the tempo accelerating into a frantic rhythm. The alarms on the machines around me blared. It was not just the physical damage to my heart anymore. It was the absolute crushing realization that the woman I had showered with millions of dollars had just weighed my life against a vacation to Hawaii and chose the vacation. She was leaving me to die alone in a sterile room so she would not miss her flight. The nurses rushed back in pushing medications through my line, shouting for the crash cart. My vision started to fade to black, but my mind was screaming. I realized then that they did not love me. They loved my bank accounts. They loved the luxury I provided. I was nothing but an infinite wallet to them. As the darkness pulled me under, the grief and betrayal evaporated. In its place, a cold, calculating rage ignited in my chest. I swore a silent oath to myself in that fading moment. If I survive this single night, Cynthia will return from her tropical paradise to find absolutely nothing left. The sterile air of this intensive care unit was heavy with the scent of antiseptic and dying hope. I lay there, tubes snaking from my arms, my chest still throbbing with the ghost of that crushing weight. The heavy steel door creaked open, and in walked Cynthia and Brandon. They were a jarring sight against the backdrop of medical monitors and beeping machines. Cynthia looked like she had just stepped off a yacht. Her hair was styled in a perfect expensive blowout, and she clutched a brand new Hermes bag that cost more than my first car. Brandon was right behind her, his tailored Italian suit jacket, sharp and unwrinkled. He looked more like a man heading to a board meeting than a stepson visiting a father who had nearly died the night before. I closed my eyes for a second, trying to steady my heart rate. When I opened them, Cynthia was hovering over my bedside. She leaned in her perfume, a sharp floral scent clashing with the hospital's medicinal smell. "Richard, honey," she said, her voice dripping with artificial warmth. She placed a manicured hand on my arm, but her touch felt cold. "The doctor says, the worst is over. You look so much better than you did last night." I did not answer. I just watched her. I wanted to see if there was any real fear in her eyes, any lingering trace of the woman who had shared my bed for 15 years. All I saw was impatience. She kept glancing at her watch, the gold links glinting under the harsh overhead lights. Brandon moved to the foot of my bed, folding his arms across his chest. He looked at the monitors, then back at me with an expression that was supposed to be concern, but looked more like a calculation. "Me staying here will just stress you out." Cynthia continued her tone, shifting to that familiar sugary sweet register she used when she wanted to manipulate me. "I know you, Richard. You hate being seen in this state. You want everyone to be strong, to be productive." She patted my hand, then pulled it away quickly, as if she had touched something dirty. "Brandon needs this Hawaii trip to decompress. Running your company has been exhausting for him. He has been taking on so much responsibility lately. You want us to be happy, right? You want to know that we are out there enjoying the fruits of your hard work while you recover." I nodded slowly, keeping my face slack. It was the easiest performance of my life. I played the role of the frail, dependent old man who was grateful for his family's presence. Inside, I was reading them like a profit and loss statement, They were not here to comfort me. They were here to ensure I would not interfere with their schedule. They were here because they needed to clear the path for their departure. I took a deep breath, feeling the mechanical whine of the ventilator nearby. Yes, I managed to whisper, my voice raspy and thin. You should go. I do not want to hold you back. A look of relief passed between them. It was subtle, almost invisible, but I saw it. Cynthia's shoulders dropped, and Brandon's face brightened. See, I told you, Brandon said, flashing that crooked grin I once mistook for sincerity. Dad knows the value of hard work. He knows we cannot just pause the world because of one bad day. I looked at my stepson. For years, I had treated Brandon as if he were my own blood. I had guided him, mentored him, and handed him the keys to the kingdom I had built with my bare hands. I had trusted him when I should have been watching his moves. Now, watching him stand at the foot of my bed, I realized he had been waiting for this moment. He was not waiting for my recovery. He was waiting for my vacancy, the office, the assets, the power. He saw them as his inheritance, and he was tired of waiting for me to step aside. Cynthia began to fuss with the collar of my hospital gown, a gesture that meant nothing. She was just keeping up appearances for the nurse passing by the door. You rest, she instructed, her voice regaining that authoritative edge. We have everything under control at the office. Brandon has already reorganized the morning schedule. You do not have to worry about a single thing. Just focus on your heart. Just focus on your health. We will call you from the airport. I watched her turn to the mirror on the wall, checking her lipstick, adjusting a stray hair. She had no intention of staying a minute longer than necessary. The hospital was a place of sickness, and Cynthia hated anything that reminded her of reality. She lived in a bubble of luxury, and I was starting to become a stain on that bubble. Brandon took a step toward me. The jovial expression shifted, becoming more professional, more transactional. He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a thick stack of legal papers. The paper was thick, expensive, the kind that held weight. It felt heavy even from where I lay. He pulled a fountain pen from his pocket, the gold nib glinting in the light. Dad, just one quick thing before we head to the airport, he said. It is just the standard medical and financial power of attorney. We need it so we can sign the new vendor contracts and keep the payroll moving while you are stuck in this bed. It is a formality. We have already gone over the details with the legal team. They just need your signature to keep things running. I stared at the papers. My pulse raced to the machine beside me, picking up the pace. This was it, the move, the play to take the keys while I was still bleeding out. They were not asking, they were finalizing. I looked at Brandon, then at the papers, and for a fleeting moment I almost laughed. They were so confident, so utterly sure of my demise, that they did not even bother to hide their true colors. I shifted in the bed, groaning as if the pain were too much to bear, my hands fumbling weakly as I reached for the pen. I was the clueless old man they wanted, and I would play that part until the very last second. I recalled the early days in the garage, the smell of grease and ambition, the cold concrete floor beneath my sleeping bag, because I was too broke for an apartment. I remembered the nights I skipped meals so I could afford that first server. I worked for every single dollar, every inch of ground I gained in this city. And now my own blood, or what I had called my blood, was treating those decades of sacrifice as a pile of loose change. My hands moved slowly, deliberately towards the pen. The air in the room felt tight, pressing against my temples, but my focus remained absolute. This was a game of shadows, and I was the one holding the lantern. Brandon stepped closer to the bed, his expensive designer cologne barely masking the sterile hospital smell. He smoothed out the thick legal pages against the plastic tray table that hovered over my lap. It is nothing major, Dad, he said, his voice maintaining that carefully rehearsed corporate calm. Just a standard medical and financial power of attorney. With you stuck in here for the foreseeable future, I need the legal authority to sign the vendor contracts and authorize the bi-weekly payroll. The banks are getting strict about these things. We cannot afford any operational delays while you recover. You know exactly how the board gets when cash flow stalls. I forced my eyes to squint, playing the part of a man whose brain was clouded by morphine and profound fatigue. But 40 years of building a logistics empire from scratch does not just vanish because of a blocked artery. My mind was sharp, evaluating every syllable he spoke. I looked down at the documents. The font was small, the legal jargon dense, exactly the kind of paperwork meant to overwhelm a dying man. But I did not need to read every single line to spot the trap. My eyes caught a specific clause buried on the second page: total liquidation rights. It was a phrase that had no business being in a temporary operational proxy. He was not asking for permission to pay our employees. He was asking for the legal right to sell my assets, empty my accounts, and completely liquidate the company I had painstakingly built. I shifted my gaze from the paperwork back to my stepson. I looked at his hands. For all his smooth talking and tailored suits, Brandon was still an amateur playing in a high-stakes arena. His left hand, resting on the edge of the plastic tray, was trembling. It was a slight, almost imperceptible tremor. But to a man who had negotiated with ruthless corporate raiders, it was a glaring siren. A drop of sweat had pooled at his temple despite the freezing air conditioning of the intensive care unit. He was terrified. He knew exactly what he was attempting to steal, and he was absolutely terrified. I would read the fine print before the ink hit the page. I let out a ragged cough, letting my head lull back against the thin hospital pillow. The heart monitor beeped in a steady, reassuring rhythm, a stark contrast to the betrayal unfolding beside my bed. "Oh, Brandon," I mumbled, slurring my words slightly to sell the performance. "You know, I cannot focus on all this dense legal text right now. Just tell me where to sign so you can catch your flight." Cynthia stepped up beside him, her impatience radiating like heat. "Just sign it, Richard," she urged, tapping her expensive shoe against the linoleum floor. "We really are going to miss the boarding call, and the traffic to the airport is going to be an absolute nightmare today." Her complete disregard for my life was breathtaking. Brandon uncapped his gold fountain pen and pressed it into my weak hand. He pointed to the dotted line at the bottom of the final page. "Right here, Dad," he instructed softly. "And initial here on the second page." I gripped the cold metal of the pen. My fingers felt stiff, but my mind was operating with crystal clarity. I had signed my name tens of thousands of times over the last 4 decades. Contracts, mergers, acquisitions, and brutal lawsuits. My signature was a brand. It had a very specific aggressive loop on the capital R, a flourish that every bank, every attorney, and every board member knew instinctively. It was the unmistakable mark of a man who owned everything he touched. But today, I was not going to be that man. I let my hand shake violently as the nib touched the heavy paper. I dragged the pen across the dotted line, crafting a jagged, sloppy scrawl. I intentionally broke the rhythm, completely omitting the signature loop. I made the letters look exactly like the desperate scribbles of a man whose brain was deprived of oxygen. It was a deliberate, undeniable forgery of my own name. Any competent forensic auditor or restructuring lawyer would spot the discrepancy immediately. My personal wealth attorney would take one single look at that document and have it legally invalidated in 5 minutes. Brandon snatched the paper, the second the pen lifted from the page. He did not even bother to check the quality of the signature. He just saw the wet ink and let out a long, shuddering breath of relief. He quickly shoved the thick stack of papers back into his suit jacket, buttoning it up to secure his stolen prize. "Thank you, Dad," he said, his voice instantly regaining its arrogant, confident edge. "This is going to make everything so much easier for everyone. You just focus on resting and letting the doctors do their jobs." Cynthia leaned down and pressed a dry, mechanical kiss to my forehead. She did not even try to look me in the eyes. "Call us when they move you out of intensive care," she said, already turning toward the door. "We will send you some pictures from the beach. Try not to stress the nurses out too much. We need to leave before the afternoon rush hour begins, or we will miss our flight entirely." I simply nodded, watching her walk away. Without another word, they turned and walked out of the trauma bay. the heavy steel door clicked shut behind them, sealing me inside the sterile room. I listened closely to the sound of Cynthia's designer heels clicking down the long hospital hallway, fading away slowly until there was absolutely nothing left but the constant rhythmic hum of the medical equipment. I stared at the blank ceiling for 10 full seconds. I remained perfectly still. I waited until I was absolutely certain they were out of the building and gone for good. Then the facade dropped. The frail, confused old man vanished into thin air. I sat up straight, ignoring the dull ache radiating through my chest. I reached up and ripped the secondary oxygen monitor off my finger. I pulled the adhesive nodes of the backup heart monitor from my collarbone. The machine let out a brief warning chirp, but I quickly silenced it by hitting the override button on the side panel. I swung my legs over the edge of the bed. My breathing was surprisingly steady. My vision was perfectly clear. I reached into the personal belongings bag the nurses had placed in the bedside cabinet and pulled out my tablet. They thought they had secured their massive fortune. They thought they were leaving a dead man behind to rot, but they had just handed a loaded weapon to a veteran street fighter. I unlocked the screen, the bright glow illuminating the dark hospital room. It was time to finally hunt down the people who betrayed me. My fingers hovered over the glass screen of the tablet. I bypassed the standard biometric security locks and accessed the master portal for our joint banking accounts. The hospital wireless network was incredibly slow, agonizingly sluggish, but the spinning loading wheel gave me a few necessary seconds to brace my mind. I had spent 15 years building a flawless financial fortress to ensure my wife would never have to worry about money. I had gladly given her a platinum card with absolutely no limit, completely assuming she would always use it with the grace and respect that accompanied our privileged life together. Now I was logging in to see exactly how quickly a supposedly grieving widow could spend her dying husband's cash. The main dashboard finally loaded, displaying a cascading list of recent transactions. I tapped directly on the primary credit account linked specifically to Cynthia. I genuinely expected to see the first-class flight upgrades she had mentioned on the phone. I expected to see the luxury resort reservations that were allegedly non-refundable. I was even prepared to see a few overpriced airport meals and expensive cocktails. What I was absolutely not prepared for was the precise, undeniable timeline of her lavish spending spree. I carefully scanned the digital timestamps aligned on the left side of the screen. My chest tightened instantly, not from a blocked coronary artery, but from a profound, sickening realization of betrayal. Exactly 2 hours after the emergency paramedics had wheeled my lifeless body out of my corporate office, and exactly 2 hours after she received the frantic telephone call from the emergency room doctor, telling her I was in critical condition, my loving wife had gone shopping. There it was, sitting proudly at the top of the digital ledger in stark black and white. A pending charge for $15,000 at a Louis Vuitton boutique located directly inside the international terminal of the airport. $15,000. While I was taking my first shallow, painful breaths under a plastic oxygen mask, fighting for every single heartbeat in a sterile trauma bay, Cynthia was casually swiping her card for designer luggage and expensive leather handbags. My eyes slowly moved down to the very next transaction on the list. It had been officially processed just 30 minutes after the boutique purchase. $12,000 paid directly to an exclusive private yacht charter company based on the coast of Maui. I stared at the numbers until my vision literally blurred. This was not a relaxing vacation to decompress. This was not a necessary trip to escape the emotional stress of my severe medical emergency. This was a victory lap. They were actively celebrating. My wife and my stepson were already spending their anticipated inheritance, popping expensive champagne on my metaphorical grave before the dirt had even been shoveled. I felt a cold, sharp clarity wash over my entire mind, instantly burning away any residual affection I ever held for the woman who had shared my home for 15 years. She was a greedy parasite, and Brandon was her willing, calculating accomplice. But parasites can only drain you if you intentionally leave the host body exposed and vulnerable. I calmly closed the personal checking portal and navigated to the secure corporate ledger for my logistics software company. I desperately needed to see exactly how much structural damage Brandon had caused while masquerading as the chief operating officer of my empire. If he had boldly pushed me to sign a document containing a total liquidation clause, he was not just looking to legally sign payroll checks for our employees. He was actively preparing to drain the business dry. I tapped on the outgoing wire transfers tab, deliberately sorting the detailed list by the last 48 hours. My eyes darted past the standard monthly vendor payments, the routine utility bills, and the regular software licensing renewals. Everything looked perfectly normal and completely mundane until I reached the very bottom of the digital page. A massive glaring anomaly sat right there in the pending outbound queue, waiting to be cleared by the bank. It was a prioritized wire transfer for exactly $50,000 pulled directly from our primary corporate operating account. I narrowed my eyes, tapping on the transaction to expand the recipient details. Wow, the funds were absolutely not going to a reliable logistics partner or a standard server hardware manufacturer. The massive sum of money was specifically wired as a non-refundable retainer fee to Vanguard and Hayes. My blood ran cold at the sight of that name. Vanguard and Hayes was one of the most ruthless, aggressive corporate restructuring law firms in the entire city of Chicago. They were absolute sharks. The exact kind of high-powered lawyers you only ever hire when you are actively planning a hostile corporate takeover, a forced bankruptcy declaration, or a massive immediate liquidation of company assets. My analytical mind raced rapidly, connecting the dark dots with lethal, unforgiving precision. Brandon was not a visionary entrepreneur. He did not possess the strategic vision, the raw intelligence, or the fundamental grit required to build a successful company from nothing. He only knew how to dismantle and sell what I had already painstakingly created. But the burning question remained, why would my seemingly loyal chief operating officer quietly hire brutal corporate liquidators while I was still technically drawing breath in a hospital intensive care unit? The timing was too perfect, too maliciously calculated. He knew about my declining health before the heart attack even happened, or he was simply ready to execute a hostile plan the very second I showed physical weakness. He was moving pieces on a chessboard while I was lying in a hospital bed attached to life support machines. The sheer audacity of his secret action was staggering. He was utilizing my own corporate funds to legally orchestrate my permanent removal from the logistics empire I built from a freezing garage. I needed a verified pair of eyes on the inside immediately. I needed a trusted ally who could safely navigate the corporate servers and see the hidden shadows Brandon was casting across my own building. Meant I minimized the banking application and opened my securely encrypted contact list. I scrolled past the useless business acquaintances and fake corporate friends until I found the only name that truly mattered right now: Sarah Jenkins. She was my brilliant, fiercely loyal chief financial officer. She had been standing right beside me since the early days, back when we could barely afford to pay the monthly heating bill. She knew every single financial secret of my company, and she absolutely despised Brandon's arrogant, entitled behavior. I stared at her name on the glowing screen, fully aware that making this telephone call would officially initiate a devastating corporate war. I took one final deep breath of the sterile hospital air, letting the cold reality of my situation settle deep into my bones. There was absolutely no turning back now. The illusion of my happy, loving family had been completely shattered, permanently replaced by a greedy syndicate of thieves waiting for my heart to stop beating. I pressed the green call button. I waited. The line rang once, twice. On the third ring, the connection clicked open, followed immediately by the sound of shuffling papers and a sharp exhale. Richard Sarah answered, her voice tight with an anxiety she rarely displayed. The hospital called the main office. They said you had a massive coronary incident. I was grabbing my coat to drive down there right now. How are you even speaking to me? Should you be on a phone, Sarah? Listen to me very carefully, I said, keeping my voice low and completely devoid of the panic she was projecting. I do not have time for medical updates, and you do not have time to drive to this hospital. I need you sitting exactly where you are, behind your desk, logged into the primary secure terminal. There was a brief, stunned silence on the other end of the line. Sarah Jenkins had been my chief financial officer for nearly 15 years, but her loyalty stretched back much further. She was my first real hire back, when the logistics empire was nothing more than 3 refurbished desktop computers, humming in a freezing Chicago garage. She had stood by me through brutal market crashes, ruthless corporate raiders, and weeks where we barely managed to scrape together enough cash to keep the server farm running. She knew my tone. She knew that when my voice dropped an octave and the emotion vanished, we were going to war. I am at my desk, Sarah confirmed her professional instincts, instantly overriding her personal concern. Tell me what you need. Brandon has locked me out of the master executive suite, I explained, staring at the sterile white tiles above my hospital bed. He just visited me here in the intensive care unit and aggressively pushed a full medical and financial power of attorney into my hands. He claimed he needed it to authorize standard vendor payments while I recover. But I just checked our outgoing corporate wire quo. Your beloved chief operating officer just forwarded a $50, non-refundable retainer fee to Vanguard and Hayes. I heard Sarah draw in a sharp, ragged breath. Even in the finance department, the name Vanguard and Hayes was universally recognized as the absolute grim reaper of corporate restructuring. That makes absolutely no sense, Sarah whispered, the rapid typing on her keyboard, echoing through the phone receiver. Brandon does not have the unilateral authority to hire external liquidation counsel, and he certainly does not have the operating budget clearance to issue a $50,000 retainer without my direct verified counter-signature. He does, if he assumes I am going to be dead before tomorrow morning, I replied coldly. He and his mother are currently sitting in the first-class lounge at the airport, waiting to board a flight to Maui. They think they have officially secured the keys to the entire kingdom. I need you to bypass the new administrative firewalls Brandon installed just last month. I need you to dig deeply into the shadow ledgers and find out exactly what financial data he has been sending to those restructuring lawyers. Richard, if I bypass his specific executive firewalls, his monitoring software will flag my terminal, Sarah warned. He will know someone is digging through his private directories. Let him know, I stated firmly. I gave that boy absolutely everything he could ever dream of. I handed him a corner office with a panoramic view of the skyline. I gave him a bloated 6-figure salary that he never earned. I paid for his luxury vehicles, his custom-tailored suits, and his exclusive country club memberships. I dressed him up and allowed him to play the role of a brilliant chief operating officer, purely out of blind love for his mother. I wanted to believe that if I gave him the world, he would eventually learn how to carry the heavy weight of it. Instead, he just learned how to steal it. He has always been a parasite, Richard, Sarah said, her voice dropping into a dangerous protective whisper. We both knew he lacked the grit to actually build anything of value. Give me 20 minutes. I am going to rip his personal servers wide open. The secure line went silent. I lowered the tablet to my chest and closed my eyes, letting the mechanical hum of the intensive care unit wash over me. My physical heart was severely damaged, heavily bruised and beating with a painful, irregular rhythm, but my mind had never been more focused. The sheer audacity of Brandon's absolute betrayal fueled my adrenaline. He genuinely believed that a fancy title and a forged document were enough to dismantle a massive logistics empire. He was about to learn a very painful lesson regarding the fundamental difference between an entitled heir and a ruthless founder. The minutes stretched on with agonizing slowness. A young nurse quietly entered the room to check my intravenous fluid lines, casting a suspicious glance at the glowing tablet resting on my lap. I simply offered her a weak, tired smile playing the role of the exhausted patient until she turned around and walked back out into the bright, loud hallway. I calculated every possible scenario in my head, visualizing the corporate battlefield. Brandon was arrogant, but he was also incredibly careless. He always left a trail of sloppy mistakes because he never truly understood the complex machinery of the software network he was supposedly managing. I knew that Sarah would find the smoking gun. Exactly 20 minutes later, my private secure line buzzed. I answered it immediately. "Sarah," I said, "what did you find?" I could hear the trembling in her breath before she even spoke a single word. The steady, reliable chief financial officer, who had fearlessly negotiated multi-million-dollar mergers without breaking a sweat, was currently shaking. Richard, Sarah began, her voice cracking under the immense weight of her discovery. Mother, Brandon is not just hiring restructuring lawyers to reorganize the vendor payrolls. I finally broke through his encrypted personal folders and found a hidden directory containing months of highly confidential internal communications. "Tell me exactly what you are looking at." I commanded, my grip tightening around the cold metallic edge of the hospital bed railing. "He has been secretly funneling our proprietary source code, our primary client databases, and our entire 5-year financial projection portfolio to an aggressive venture capital firm based out of New York." Sarah explained, the sound of her frantic scrolling filling the quiet room. "He has deliberately bypassed our internal legal department and engaged Vanguard and Hayes to aggressively expedite the due diligence process. He is using that new power of attorney document to bypass your mandatory shareholder approval." She paused, letting the devastating reality of the situation settle between us in the cold silence. The oxygen machine hummed loudly beside my bed, a stark reminder of my vulnerability. But the weakness in my physical body was instantly replaced by a burning, unyielding resolve. "Richard," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over the sterile noise of the busy intensive care unit. "Brandon is not just running payroll. I found the emails. He is selling the entire company. Selling the company." I repeated the words, tasting like ash in my mouth. My voice was completely flat. The heart monitor beside my bed maintained its steady rhythmic pulse, betraying none of the absolute fury igniting in my veins. I instructed Sarah to print every single document, every email thread, and every hidden contract she had managed to excavate from his server. I told her to put it all on physical paper. Digital files could be wiped remotely, but physical ink was permanent. I told her to bring the documents to the intensive care unit immediately, but she needed a cover story. Brandon had undoubtedly left strict instructions with the nursing staff regarding my visitors. Sarah understood perfectly, exactly. 45 minutes later, the heavy door to my hospital room swung open. Sarah walked in. She was carrying a massive, ostentatious gift basket, wrapped in bright yellow cellophane and stuffed with exotic fruits. To any passing doctor or nurse, she was merely a concerned corporate colleague, delivering a standard get-well-soon present. But as she set the heavy basket down on the rolling tray table over my lap, her eyes met mine. They were fierce, filled with the same unyielding grit that had helped us build a logistics empire from a freezing concrete floor. She pulled a hidden zipper at the bottom of the woven basket and extracted a thick manila folder. She slid it smoothly under my hospital blanket. "The nurses think I am just here to drop this off and say a quick prayer," Sarah whispered, glancing nervously at the small glass window of my room. "You have about 10 minutes before they come back to check your intravenous lines. Read fast, Richard. It is worse than we could have ever imagined." I nodded, waiting for her to step back out into the hallway to stand guard. Once the door clicked shut, I pulled the heavy folder from beneath the thin cotton blanket. My fingers were slightly numb from the medication, but my mind operated with lethal precision. I opened the cover. The very first document was a formal letter of intent from a prominent New York venture capital firm. They were absolute corporate vultures, legendary for buying vulnerable tech companies, stripping their assets, and firing the staff to maximize short-term profits. I read the numbers. Brandon had agreed to sell 30% of my software empire at a humiliatingly deep discount. He was giving away our proprietary supply chain algorithms for a fraction of their true market value, and the timeline was completely devastating. The final execution date was set for this coming Monday morning. I flipped to the next page, my breathing remaining slow and measured. The mechanics of his betrayal were laid out in stark black and white ink. Will Brandon had quietly negotiated this entire deal over the past 4 months. He used his position as chief operating officer to isolate the legal department, feeding them fabricated projections to justify a search for outside liquidity. But he had always faced one insurmountable hurdle. He did not possess the ultimate executive authority to sign away equity. That power rested exclusively with me, unless of course I was legally incapacitated or dead. I stared at an email thread between Brandon and the lead partner at Vanguard and Hayes. Brandon guaranteed that a full medical and financial power of attorney would be secured by the end of the week. He promised the lawyers the document would grant him total liquidation rights, bypassing standard shareholder approval. He had orchestrated this entire sequence of events perfectly. He just needed my heart to fail. When it finally did, he and his mother wasted absolutely no time. They secured the signature, packed their designer luggage, and boarded a flight to Hawaii, leaving the vultures to feast on the remains of my work. I continued to turn the pages, the cold reality of my situation settling deeply into my chest. The financial documents were infuriating, but they were simply business. The final document in the folder, however, was something entirely different. It was a printed copy of a forwarded email. Brandon had sent it to his wife, Tiffany, directly from his personal phone just hours before they left for the airport. The subject line was blank. I read his message carefully. The words were burned into my memory instantly. He wrote, "The lawyers are ready for Monday. Once the old man croaks, the holding company automatically defaults to Mom. We take our 30% cash out, let the venture guys strip the remaining assets, and he dies a forgotten footnote. Start looking at those properties in the Hamptons. We are finally free." He dies a forgotten footnote. I read that single sentence 3 times. For 15 years, I provided this boy with a life of absolute privilege. I paid for his education, handed him a career, and treated him with respect. And in return, he viewed my impending death as a convenient financial transaction. He did not just want my money. He wanted to erase my legacy completely. He wanted to take the empire I built through blood, sweat, and sacrifice, and trade it for a vacation home and a quick payout. I closed the folder and rested my hands on top of it. A normal man might have broken down. A normal man might have wept at the sheer cruelty of his own family. A normal man might have pressed the call button, begging for sedatives to dull the emotional pain. But I did not cry. My heart monitor did not spike. My breathing did not hitch. Instead, staring at the sterile wall, I smiled. It was a cold, quiet, terrifying smile. Brandon had made a fatal miscalculation. He had assumed that because I was 70 years old and lying in a hospital bed, I was weak. He had assumed that a piece of paper signed with shaky ink was enough to topple a king. He had severely underestimated the kind of monster you have to become to build an empire from a freezing garage in Chicago. I slipped the folder back under my blanket, just as the heavy door swung open. Sarah stepped back inside, followed closely by a young nurse checking her clipboard. I let my smile fade, replacing it instantly with the mask of a tired, broken old man. The nurse adjusted my intravenous drip, smiled sympathetically at Sarah, and quietly left the room. Sarah rushed to my bedside, her eyes wide with concern and fear. "Richard," she whispered urgently, "what are we going to do? He is going to sign those final papers on Monday morning. If that venture capital firm gets their hands on our source code, we are completely finished." I looked at my brilliant chief financial officer. My voice was steady, dropping into a tone she had not heard from me since our most brutal corporate battles a decade ago. "Sarah, my friend," I said calmly, "call Harrison Cole. Tell him to use the freight elevator and bypass the front desk. I want him sitting in this room in exactly 1 hour. We have a company to save and a family to destroy. The heavy wooden door to my hospital room remained closed. I lay perfectly still against the stiff mattress, watching the second-hand sweep across the large wall clock. Exactly 58 minutes had passed since my conversation with Sarah. The intensive care unit was deceptively quiet, a stark contrast to the absolute warfare currently brewing inside my mind. Suddenly, the handle clicked. The door did not swing wide open like it did when the nurses entered for their rounds. It opened just enough for a tall, impeccably dressed man to slip through the narrow gap. Harrison Cole had arrived. He brushed a speck of invisible dust from the lapel of his charcoal suit and locked the door behind him. Harrison was 50 years old, sharp as a scalpel, and utterly devoid of professional mercy. He was my personal wealth attorney, a man who charged $2,000 an hour to make rich men impenetrable. I had explicitly instructed Sarah to tell him to use the underground freight elevator and navigate through the basement utility corridors. I needed his arrival to remain completely undocumented by the main hospital lobby security cameras. If Brandon had placed anyone on the payroll to monitor my visitors, I could not risk them spotting the city's most feared wealth protector walking into my room. B. Harrison approached the foot of my bed, his eyes scanning the medical monitors before finally resting on my face. "You look remarkably alert for a man who officially died for 90 seconds yesterday morning," he stated, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that commanded instant authority. I let out a dry, humorless breath. "Death is surprisingly motivating, Harrison." I reached beneath my thin hospital blanket and pulled out the thick manila folder Sarah had smuggled inside the fruit basket. I tossed it onto the plastic tray table. "I need you to read this immediately," I commanded. Every single page. Harrison did not ask any useless questions. He pulled a pair of reading glasses from his breast pocket, dragged a plastic visitor chair to the side of my bed, and opened the folder. I watched his face closely as he reviewed the digital blood trail. For a man who made a lucrative living navigating high-stakes corporate divorces and vicious, hostile takeovers, Harrison rarely showed genuine surprise. But as his eyes scanned the credit card statements showing Cynthia swiping her platinum card for $15,000 worth of designer luggage and $12,000 for a private Maui yacht charter, his jaw visibly tightened. He turned the page, moving on to the corporate ledger Sarah had extracted. I saw his eyebrows rise a fraction of an inch when he registered the $50.00 non-refundable retainer fee, wired directly from my operating account to Vanguard and Hayes. Finally, he reached the printed emails. He read Brandon's arrogant declaration of his impending corporate sale, the secret negotiations with the New York venture capital firm, and the ultimate damning message sent to Tiffany. He read the line where Brandon referred to my death as a convenient footnote. Harrison closed the thick folder and slowly took off his glasses, folding the arms with a sharp metallic click. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic beeping of my heart monitor. "I have dealt with some truly despicable human beings in my career," Richard Harrison said, his voice laced with a cold professional disgust. "I have seen brothers steal from brothers and children bankrupt their own parents. But the sheer velocity of this betrayal is staggering. They are actively looting your personal estate before your body has even had a chance to grow cold." I nodded slowly, staring at the blank television screen mounted on the wall. "Brandon also paid me a visit before his flight to Hawaii," I explained quietly. "He brought a full medical and financial power of attorney. He told me it was just to authorize vendor payments and keep the payroll moving while I was stuck in this bed. I knew exactly what it really was. He needs that specific document to legally bypass the mandatory shareholder approval and finalize the software company's sale on Monday morning." Miri Harrison leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Tell me you did not sign that document, Richard. Tell me you did not hand that boy the loaded gun he needs to execute this deal." I looked directly into my attorney's eyes. "I signed it," I replied. Harrison let out a sharp sigh of frustration, running a hand over his face. Richard, if you legally granted him that authority, we are going to have to file an emergency injunction to freeze the sale. We will have to argue that you were heavily medicated and not of sound mind. It will be a massive public legal battle. I raised my hand to stop his rising panic. I signed it. I repeated smoothly, but I did not use my actual signature. I crafted a deliberate, jagged forgery. I completely omitted the distinctive loop on the capital letter R. I made it look exactly like the desperate, uncoordinated scribble of an old man suffering from profound oxygen deprivation and powerful narcotics. I handed him a completely invalid piece of paper, and he was so terrified and eager to steal my empire that he snatched it away without even verifying the ink. Harrison paused, processing the tactical brilliance of the move. A slow, predatory smile spread across his face. He leaned back in the plastic chair, shaking his head in sheer disbelief. "You gave him a defective grenade," he murmured. "The moment Vanguard and Hayes attempt to submit that power of attorney to the bank or the venture capital firm, their own compliance officers will flag the signature discrepancy. We can legally invalidate the entire proxy in less than 5 minutes. It is a brilliant defensive play, Richard. We can stop the corporate sale on Monday morning and immediately strip Brandon of his Chief Operating Officer title." I shook my head, gripping the edge of the blanket tightly. "You are not listening to me, Harrison. I do not want to play defense. Stopping the sale is merely a temporary bandage. If we just invalidate the document and fire him, he will spin a lie. He will tell the board he was trying to save the company while I was incapacitated. Cynthia will claim the yacht was just a preemptive memorial gathering. They will hire their own aggressive legal counsel, demand massive severance packages, file for a highly publicized divorce, and attempt to drag my reputation through the mud for the next 3 years. I will not allow them to dictate the terms of this war. I want complete and total annihilation. I want you to prepare the legal framework to quietly transfer all liquid assets into a blind trust by Sunday night. I want the credit cards completely severed." Harrison narrowed his eyes, analyzing the full scope of the requested destruction. "If we pull this trigger, Richard Cynthia will be left with absolutely nothing. Are you prepared for that?" I looked at my attorney, my heart beating with cold absolute certainty. "Make it -0. Harrison stared at me for a long moment, the heavy silence of the intensive care unit amplifying the staggering weight of my demand. He did not argue or attempt to temper my absolute fury. He simply nodded slowly, his expression hardening into a chilling mask of pure professional ruthlessness. He packed his reading glasses back into his tailored breast pocket and stood up from the cheap plastic visitor chair. "I will have the comprehensive trust framework drafted and completely ready for your execution signature by midnight," he said, his voice dropping into a barely audible whisper. "But we cannot securely conduct a sensitive financial operation of this massive magnitude from a heavily monitored hospital bed. You need a highly secure, entirely private location with completely unrestricted network access and absolutely no potential for sudden interruptions." I told him I would personally handle my own medical extraction and explicitly instructed him to meet me at a confidential secondary location. After he quietly slipped back out through the heavy wooden door, deliberately returning to the unmonitored basement utility corridors, I firmly pressed the plastic nurse call button. It took 20 grueling minutes of incredibly aggressive negotiation, 3 forcefully signed legal waivers, releasing the entire medical facility from any and all potential liability, and an explicit, unyielding threat to personally purchase the entire cardiac hospital wing just to fire the attending physician, to finally process a formal against medical advice discharge. I honestly did not care about the severe physical risk. Lying in that sterile bed, helplessly waiting for my bruised heart to fail, was a pathetic passive surrender. Taking absolute ruthless control of my sprawling corporate empire, even with painfully bruised ribs and severely strained arteries, was the only genuine medicine my exhausted body actually required right now. At exactly 2 in the morning, the sprawling hospital corridors were dimly lit and hauntingly quiet. The exhausted night shift staff moved sluggishly behind their illuminated counters, paying absolutely no attention to the supposedly dying old man dressed in loose civilian clothes who was walking slowly and deliberately toward the rear service exit. Every single step sent a sharp, agonizing ache radiating deeply through my damaged chest, serving as a brutal physical reminder of the severe medical trauma my aging body had miraculously survived just 36 hours prior. But my focused mind completely pushed the blinding pain aside, heavily fueled by a cold, burning adrenaline that pumped fiercely through my veins. Sarah was already waiting patiently in the dark loading dock alleyway, sitting inside a discreet, heavily tinted black sedan, the powerful engine idling silently in the freezing, bitter Chicago air. I carefully climbed into the leather passenger seat, tightly gripping the plastic dashboard with trembling fingers until my erratic breathing finally stabilized. She did not bother to ask how I was feeling or question my reckless medical decision. She simply reached into the back seat, handed me a fully charged, secured laptop computer, and rapidly pulled away from the dark concrete curb. We drove in complete silence through the deserted city streets, navigating toward a highly private, unlisted loft apartment I secretly owned deep within the industrial district. It was a secure, heavily fortified haven I had quietly purchased several years ago, operating under a completely anonymous shell corporation, designed specifically to serve as a hidden command center for extreme corporate emergencies. Cynthia knew absolutely nothing about this hidden property. Tonight, it would serve as the ultimate launching pad for my absolute, uncompromising vengeance. Harrison was already waiting impatiently inside the expansive loft when we finally arrived. His leather briefcase opened wide on a large oak dining table, completely surrounded by thick stacks of freshly printed, legally binding documents. For the next 24 exhausting hours, we absolutely did not sleep. We barely even paused to eat, aggressively sustaining ourselves on bitter black coffee and an endless reservoir of sheer unadulterated willpower. We barely spoke loud enough to hear communicating efficiently and ruthlessly in complex account numbers, international routing codes, massive wire authorizations, and heavily encrypted server passwords. We were rapidly dismantling a massive multi-million-dollar financial fortress brick by heavy brick and systematically rebuilding it safely behind completely impenetrable legal walls. First, we aggressively attacked the core corporate structure. Utilizing my legitimate, legally verified digital executive signature, I unilaterally and permanently terminated Brandon's official status as the chief operating officer of my company, permanently stripping his administrative network access and legally nullifying his ability to authorize any future business transactions. I then methodically transferred all 90% of my controlling corporate voting shares directly into a newly established, fully irrevocable blind trust that Harrison had masterfully constructed. That arrogant, aggressive venture capital firm operating out of New York would suddenly wake up on Monday morning to discover that the vulnerable holding company they were actively attempting to purchase no longer legally existed in any recognizable form. The phantom executive authority Brandon had confidently promised to deliver to them was now entirely legally worthless. Next, we aggressively pursued the personal wealth portfolios I had accumulated. I systematically liquidated the conservative mutual funds, the highly lucrative offshore investment accounts, and the massive high-yield dividend portfolios I had carefully curated over 4 decades of tireless labor. Every single dollar, every piece of valuable commercial real estate, and every hidden corporate asset was quietly and swiftly funneled directly into the impenetrable ironclad trust. Harrison drafted the complex legal framework with flawless surgical precision, definitively ensuring that my vast financial assets were completely shielded from any potential future divorce proceedings, aggressive spousal asset claims, or hostile corporate litigation that Cynthia and her treacherous son might attempt to desperately launch. The final devastating step of our relentless operation was arguably the most deeply personal. I slowly logged into the primary joint checking account, the limitless overflowing fountain of personal wealth that Cynthia had been brazenly using to generously fund her lavish, celebratory Maui vacation. I sat in the dim light of the secure loft and watched her various pending financial charges processing in real time across the glowing screen. The extraordinarily expensive private yacht rental, the ridiculous designer boutique, purchases the exorbitant luxury room service bills flowing endlessly from the resort. With a few precise, deliberate keystrokes on the encrypted laptop, I confidently initiated a massive final outbound wire transfer, draining that specific personal account completely and utterly dry. I purposely chose to leave exactly $43.50 remaining in the available daily balance. It was just enough money for a treacherous, ungrateful wife to buy a cheap, highly processed airport lunch on her humiliating journey home, and absolutely nothing more. I calmly closed the heavy laptop screen, the sharp, satisfying metallic click echoing loudly through the otherwise completely silent loft apartment. My damaged chest ached profoundly. My eyes were heavy with a deeply profound exhaustion, but a vast, incredibly satisfying peace finally settled over my weary soul. The intricate financial execution was utterly flawless. The devastating trap was officially legally set. Now I just had to sit back comfortably in the quiet, secure shadows of my hidden safe house and patiently wait for the massive, destructive bomb to finally detonate in paradise. The morning sun slowly began to filter through the heavy industrial blinds of my safe house, casting long geometric shadows across the oak dining table. Harrison had departed hours ago, leaving me alone with my thoughts, my cold coffee, and a completely untraceable burner phone resting on the polished wood. I sat perfectly still, listening to the distant, muffled sounds of the city waking up. In Chicago, it was a crisp, unforgiving Monday morning, but in Maui, it was late Sunday evening, the absolute peak of the luxury dinner hour. I did not have to wait long for the fallout to reach me. At exactly 8:15, the burner phone vibrated, shattering the heavy silence of the loft. It was an automated notification from my secure corporate server, alerting me that an emergency voicemail had been deposited into my heavily encrypted private inbox. Brandon and Cynthia had naturally assumed my primary phone was either turned off or sitting uselessly in a hospital locker. They had no idea my communications were automatically forwarded to the secure cloud. I tapped the screen, selected the first audio file, and pressed play, letting the digital recording fill the quiet room. The audio began with a cacophony of vibrant background noise. I could hear the gentle crash of ocean waves, the soft rhythmic strumming of a live acoustic guitar, and the distinct, unmistakable clinking of fine crystal. They were dining at the open-air restaurant of the Four Seasons, a place where the menu did not bother to list the prices. Cynthia's voice came through the speaker first, high-pitched, strained, and dripping with an ugly, arrogant indignation. She was not leaving a message for me. She had aggressively dialed the 24-hour concierge line for our private wealth management bank, unaware that Harrison had already routed all high-level account inquiries directly to an automated recording system that forwarded the panicked audio straight to my desk. "Listen to me very carefully," Cynthia hissed into the phone. Her words slightly slurred from what I easily deduced was an excessive amount of expensive alcohol. "I am Cynthia Vales. I am currently sitting at a private oceanfront table attempting to pay for a celebratory dinner, and your incompetent fraud department has completely embarrassed me in front of my family. I need a senior account manager on the line right this second." In the background of the recording, I could clearly hear Brandon laughing, an arrogant, relaxed sound that made my chest ache with fresh anger. I heard him casually tell a waiter to bring another bottle of their finest vintage champagne, a vintage I knew for a fact cost upwards of $500 a bottle. He was celebrating his brilliant corporate coup, completely oblivious to the financial guillotine swinging down toward his neck. I am waiting. Cynthia snapped at the automated banking prompt, her patience rapidly disintegrating. My black card was just declined by a 20-year-old waiter. Do you have any idea how humiliating that is? I have an absolute zero limit on this account. You need to remove the travel block immediately. There was a pause in her rant, and I could hear the rustling of fabric, the sound of her digging frantically through her designer handbag. The waiter must have returned to the table because her tone suddenly shifted from entitled rage to a tight, uncomfortable, forced politeness. Yes, I am speaking with the bank right now, she said clearly, addressing the unseen hotel staff member. It is simply a routine security measure because we flew in from Chicago yesterday. They are overly cautious with the platinum accounts here. Just run these alternative cards while I sort out the primary line.